We're here in Egypt, and we're at a place that is culturally predates the biblical narrative by centuries. Now, I love the picture of where we are this morning. Every time I'm here, I'm guaranteed the honking of horns. Hear them? All the traffic going by. And in the background, what do you see? You see the magnificent pyramids. Those pyramids were almost 1,000 years old when Abraham walked by. Now, I don't know if Abram walked by here, but I know that Abram came to Egypt, and you do too, the text tells us, but they were almost 1,000 years old. Unbelievable. And Abram, that old shepherd who came in here with his wife and his flocks, and who in a wilderness context was a man of wealth, but he walks by these pyramids, and I could see his jaw dropping. And God had brought him to Egypt. Now, Abraham is one of those listed in Hebrews 11 who lived by faith. He's listed as one of those who was promised but didn't receive a promise, but had such a relationship with God that he could look into the future and embrace something as his, although he has not yet received it. Faith is being sure of what you hope for, certain of what you do not see. Now, if I had to pick, and you could pick many of them, but if I could pick someone who ought to be in Hebrews 11 but isn't, I would pick, my first candidate would be Job. Here's the man Job, and he's just loving God. He's praying for his kids. His flocks, his herds are increasing. He's reasonably healthy, and everything's fine until some heavenly council gets together, and then God says to the opposer, to the accuser, in Hebrew, Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job?" So God's the one who starts to stir the pot. And Job loses basically everything. In Job's journey, he says this, Job chapter 23. He's discouraged, he's almost lost it all. And then Job says these words, "If I look to the east, I do not see him. If I look to the west, I do not see him. And when he's at work in the north, I cannot see him. And when he goes to the south, I catch no glimpse of him. Yet he knows the way that I take. And when he has tested me, I will come forth as gold." Now that, in my opinion, is the anthem. That ought to be a verse that all of God's people memorize, because I think that verse is at least should be a part of the chorus of the song of faith of God's people. It's the declaration of one of God's children who says, basically, I don't know what God's up to. I have no idea. But this is what I do know. He knows where I am. And he knows the path that I'm taking. And when he has tested me, I will come forth as gold. Now I'll tell you something. You serve a God who loves you with all of his heart, with all of his soul, with all of his strength. And if you need to measure that, I invite you to a place called Calvary, where he put his one and only Son for you and for me. I can't begin to tell you how much God loves you. He loves you. But I'll also tell you, it is also in the same biblical narrative that it is part of the way for God's people at times to be placed in harm's way, to be placed in wild places. Places where we wonder if God's character is what we've even thought it would be in what the Bible talks about. It's at those places, at those times of testing, that we need to embrace Job's words. I look to the east, I don't see him. I look to the west, I don't see him. When he's at work in the north, I catch no glimpse of him. And when he turns and goes to the south, nothing. But he knows the way that I take. And when he has tested me, I will come forth as gold. We're looking at ancient Egypt. This is not Egypt. This is the wilderness. Egypt is right there. Now, we are in Upper Egypt. Luxor, Thebes, ancient Thebes, which was basically the capital of New Kingdom Egypt. We're on the West Bank, where the sun sets, the place of the mortuary temples. We are also in one of my favorite places to be on the whole trip. In fact, if I could, I would love to do a trip entirely in the wilderness. It's in the wilderness that God forms his people. They come into the wilderness as it were a baby nation. They come into the wilderness coming out of Egypt. They're scared, they're timid, they're easily startled. But it's in the wilderness that God forms his people so that when it comes to the Jordan River, God says, hey, I'm not doing anything until you first step in. And what do? They step in. So I love the wilderness, and I think God loves the wilderness. And I think God in the wilderness raises up a people who are a wilderness people. God brings his people to Egypt. They're in Egypt over 400 years. And then it's time to come out of Egypt. And it's huge for me. Absolutely huge. One of the questions we ask is, why did God bring his people to Egypt? Well, what is Egypt? When I look at this picture right here, have a look at it. One of the reasons I think why Egypt, because with Egypt, you're either in or you're out. You're either in Egypt or you're out of it. Look at, you can see that green line. That fertility of the Nile that's deposited, that beautiful silt, and it comes so far and no farther, and you step across that and you are in severe wilderness. You're either in or you're out. Now what's interesting about this is God brought his people out of Egypt, and they didn't immediately step into the promised land. They came out of Egypt and they are in a wilderness. And they're in the wilderness for 40 years. 40, an interesting number. The Pirkei Avot, the sayings of the Father, stipulates that the number 40 is the number of understanding. And after 40 years in the wilderness, then they go into the promised land. Now I'll tell you something, when I was in ministry at Holland Heights Church, in ministry, when I first started, we had people who were in their Egypt, whether Egypt of addiction, financial irresponsibility, whatever their Egypt was, it was an Egypt where they had great need. And we would come in and we would try to take them out of Egypt. We would pay their rent, we would pay their heat bill, we'd buy them a car. And all we were really doing was we were trying to take them out of Egypt, and we were trying to skip the wilderness. Listen, The wilderness is where God shapes his people, where God forms his people. It is a wild place, yes. But don't deny people their wilderness. Because God looks firmly on the wilderness. The wilderness is a place everything is stripped away. And you know it. And all you have is God. I think sometimes God brings us into a wilderness and keeps us in that wilderness because that's the first time in a long time, if ever, we've had an honest conversation with him where everything is stripped away, where we honestly recognize our need and our dependency upon him. Egypt. You're either in or you're out. The wilderness, it's a wild place, but that's a wild place. May not be as obvious, but it is a wild place.